Hello and welcome back. This is the week 8 lecture. So today I would like to cover chapter 3 and talk a little bit about the major historical periods of literature. Obviously, this class is an introduction to literary study, so in order for us to understand literature a little bit better, we need to know the basics about literary history. We don't need to be experts in this field. We don't need to know it all. And honestly, we might get a little bit more detail than we absolutely need here in chapter 3. I think our author might overload us with information at times. So here in this lecture, I would like to clarify a few things from the chapter, but I would also like to just sort of streamline the chapter and give you guys the most important info that I would like you to remember and perhaps write about later. So our focus primarily here is going to be on English language literature. We're looking at the development of literature in the Western world specifically, and we're going to be focusing mostly on English language traditions, and eventually we're going to turn our focus to the literature of the United States, our own national literary tradition. But we have to start in classical antiquity, going all the way back to roughly 3000 BC. As we learned several weeks ago, ancient epics were a staple of a lot of ancient societies and cultures. We already know that. So one of the earliest works of literature that we are aware of dates back to the ancient Sumerians, who wrote the epic known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. So the Sumerians lived in what's known as sort of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. That's in the modern day Middle East, probably in modern day Iraq somewhere. And the Epic of Gilgamesh was probably written between 2100 and 600 BC. So with BC, of course, we're talking about before the birth of Christ. So this is ancient history, but we know the Sumerians had their epic, other ancient cultures had their own, and a lot of these epics were similar in terms of plots, characters, and themes. And if we move over to ancient Greece, around the 8th century BC, we see the development of ancient Greek epics. And we're still familiar with these texts, of course. The Iliad, the Odyssey, both attributed to Homer, although there might have been multiple authors responsible for them. We read excerpts from the Odyssey several weeks ago when we were studying epics. So we're already familiar with these texts. They are often taught in American high schools. We know them. We know a little bit about ancient Greek literature because that stuff has been influential for so long. It's influenced so many other eras of literature. So in the 8th century, we begin to see epics in ancient Greece. Around the 6th century, we begin to see more lyric poetry coming out of ancient Greece. And then in the 5th century, they established democracy, particularly in Athens. And after that political innovation, we see the development of an ancient Greek drama tradition. We see theater develop. And we've already talked a little bit about the origins of theater pretty recently when we were studying drama as one of our key literary genres. So we're pretty sure that Greek plays and lyric poetry both probably grew out of certain religious festivals, fertility cults, other ceremonies and festivals that they had in which art played a part. Art was a part of the larger festival. We think that's where poetry and plays probably originated. And then a little bit later, in what we call sort of late antiquity, the end of the BC days and the early AD days, right after the birth of Christ, we see the development of some prose fiction in ancient Greece. We see, we wouldn't quite call them novels, but they're not plays or poems either. They are written in prose. They're often sort of adventure tales mixed in with love stories and also other elements like travelogues or travel narratives. They're kind of weird. We might think of them as sort of ancient indirect ancestors of the modern novel. So right after the ancient Greeks, we have the ancient Romans, sort of continuing in those same footsteps, continuing to produce epics, lyric poetry, and even a little bit of prose fiction. So these traditional genres of literature that the Greeks developed, the Romans are continuing to work in those genres, very much influenced by the Greeks. So some important Roman writers of the late BC days and the very early AD days would have been Terence, Horace, Virgil, and Ovid. These were important authors not just in their own day, but they also influenced a lot of writers in medieval Europe. So if we move ahead in time, if we move into medieval Europe and the Middle Ages, we see some changes in literary production. Literary production drops off a little bit, but it does not stop. It does not cease. So the Middle Ages officially start after the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. So if we go to medieval Europe, we see a lot of the same literary genres continuing to flourish. We see epics, we see lyric poetry. But in these days, a lot of literature, particularly in England, would have been kept in monasteries, where monks live. Those became the homes for a lot of ancient literature and contemporary literature, which was often produced by monks. So a lot of monks and other members of the church were writing poetry, in some cases epics, and also histories. So during this period known as the Anglo-Saxon era in England, also known as the Old English period, we do have some important works of literature being produced, such as Beowulf, which is an epic from that time, probably written in the 8th century AD. We're not clear on the author. Again, there might have been multiple authors. It might have been an oral tradition before it was ever written down. But that's an example of an old Anglo-Saxon text or an example of an old English work of literature. And if you guys know anything about this period, you know that the Anglo-Saxons were Germanic peoples that had come from the mainland of Europe, and they had sort of immigrated or invaded England in previous centuries, and they brought with them their Germanic language. So that's what was spoken in England during this time. We call it Old English, but a modern day speaker of English could not just sit down and read Beowulf in its original form. We would need a translation, or we would need to be trained in Old English. We would have to learn the language, learn the grammar, learn the rules, because it is Germanic in terms of its origin. So it doesn't sound like modern English. So keep that in mind. But literature keeps going. But again, things have changed, and it's not available to quite as many people as perhaps it was back in the ancient world. It's not being produced at quite the same rate, with quite the same frequency, but a lot of those literary genres, those older literary genres that the ancient peoples had, those remain in place. So a little bit more history. Let's move ahead to the 1000s. In 1066, the Normans, a French-speaking people from France, invaded and conquered England. They sort of defeated the Anglo-Saxons and the other peoples who were already living there. So this is a major change in the history of England. Again, we don't need to be experts, but we need to understand that the Norman invasion changed the language spoken in England, it changed the culture, and obviously it also changed the literature. So this is the beginning of the Middle English period. And we have several noteworthy authors producing poetry and epics during this period. Writers like William Langland, Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, pretty famous text. We still read it. We still know it. Also, Thomas Malory. You might not know that name, but you probably know what he wrote about, because he helped to popularize the King Arthur legend. the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot, all that stuff, Lancelot. Mallory helped to really sort of popularize those legends and those myths, which had existed for a long time, but he sort of set them down in writing in one place. And Mallory was typical of that period. So he was an Englishman. He lived in the 1400s. He wrote his prose narratives about King Arthur in the 1400s. So these were not works of poetry. They weren't quite epics in the traditional sense. We would consider them kind of forerunners of the novel because they were examples of fiction. They were prose fiction, kind of lengthy adventure stories that were largely based on sort of local mythology and legends. But Mallory was an Englishman, born and lived his life in England, but he spoke what we would recognize as something sounding more like French. So obviously with the Normans coming over, they brought the French language with them. And that became the official language of England for several hundreds of years. But what often happens in situations like this, when you have one people conquering another, one language supposedly taking the place of another, often what you end up with is this kind of weird mixture. And in this case, the older sort of Anglo-Saxon Germanic language that already existed in England sort of combined with and melded with the French language that the Normans were bringing with them. I'm no linguist, I'm no historian, so I can't get into a ton of detail, but this is the beginnings of what we would now recognize as modern English. But in the Middle English period, again, that would be difficult. It would be difficult for us to read the texts in their original form from that period because a lot of the vocabulary words would have been French, even though a lot of the grammatical structures in some cases may have remained Germanic. So this is still true to a certain extent of the English language. We have a Germanic sort of grammar, but a lot of our words, a lot of our vocabulary words do come from France, or they're borrowed, they come from French, or they're borrowed from some other Romance languages. So we are this kind of weird amalgamation of Romance language, Germanic language, kind of this weird combo, and that's happening. That sort of melding process is playing out throughout the Middle English period, where we have Chaucer and Mallory writing. Again, if you were to sit down and read Chaucer, you might want a modern translation, or at the very least, you would need to rely very heavily on footnotes and explanations provided by the editor of that particular book, because it's very hard for a modern person to read Middle English. I would argue that Middle English is almost intelligible. You would be able to recognize certain words and certain syntax, but Old English is, virtually unintelligible for a modern day English speaker. So another thing that happens, during this Middle English period over the course of the 1300s and the 1400s, we see the return of drama. Drama or plays had been largely absent from the literature of the Western world for about a millennium. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans had plays, but after the fall of those societies, we didn't see a lot of drama throughout much of the Middle Ages, but towards the end of this period, we see something that we've already talked about, the development of passion plays or miracle plays, these religious-themed plays that became popular in the 13 and 1400s. So this is kind of a new type of theater tradition that hadn't really existed previously in those ancient cultures. It's a little bit of a new thing, and it's a little bit less formal. A lot of those plays were held outside, out in the churchyard or out in front of an inn, and they were usually very simple and relatively short. They would take episodes from the Bible and basically repackage them for a medieval audience. But that became a pretty popular literary form as well towards the end of the medieval period. But next, we move into the Renaissance. And this is a historical development that most of you are probably somewhat familiar with. You've learned about it in school previously. You've at least heard this term before. So the Renaissance, that word literally means rebirth. So this is a time of great change. This era kind of begins in the 1400s, and it kind of sweeps across Europe. Starting in Italy, really, we sweep across Europe over the course of the 14 and 1500s. A lot changes. A lot of things are happening in the world at that time that help to kind of modernize the world. We're kind of pushed forward during the Renaissance. A lot of innovations, a lot of technological advancements, a lot of scientific breakthroughs. This is the beginning of the age of exploration. This is when we see European explorers going to the New World. In the 1400s, we see the invention of the printing press. This is a big deal. This allows us to mass produce books. This allows us to mass produce literature. So, like we've talked about before the printing press, you could make copies of epics or poems or, prose fiction, but you had to make all copies by hand writing the copies. And it would usually be monks sitting in some monastery doing that kind of work. So obviously this was very inefficient, and there weren't a lot of copies of certain text out there in circulation. But this all changed in the 1400s with the printing press. Now we could create hundreds, thousands of copies. This created a whole new kind of literary marketplace. Suddenly, books became a lot more accessible. It became a lot easier to acquire works of literature. You could just walk down to your corner bookseller and pick up something to read for the week. So this made literature more available, and it helped to popularize some of these literary genres. Also, in the 1500s, we have the Protestant Reformation. So we have all of these different sort of Christian denominations breaking away from the Catholic Church. That really changed the whole religious landscape of Europe during this time. So a lot of historians would say that the Renaissance helps to usher in what we would call the early modern period. So we're leaving the Middle Ages behind, and we're entering into the beginning of modernity. The world is beginning to shrink. We're learning more. We're becoming more advanced. So, of course, literature is changing as well. And we can really notice that when we jump to the Elizabethan era in England, which begins around the middle of the 1500s. So this is the 16th century, the 1500s, and this is a very fertile era for literature in England. We see a lot of important writers active during this time, like Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, and of course, most famously, William Shakespeare. They are all producing plays. In some cases, some of them are writing lyric poetry as well. We also see some prose fiction from the Elizabethan era, but again, we're not really seeing novels yet. We're not seeing modern novels, but all of those traditional categories of literature are still in play. We have drama, we have lyric poetry, and we do have some forms of prose fiction. So we remember Shakespeare, but we still read Marlowe as well. We still read Spenser. These are influential writers. And we're seeing a lot of developments in the English language. It's becoming a little bit more standardized. It's becoming a little bit more recognizable to contemporary people as we emerge out of that Middle English stage. So Shakespeare is writing in the early modern period. So yes, it is difficult for us to understand him sometimes, but he is using an early modern version of English. It is a little bit more recognizable, a lot more recognizable, really, than what we would have seen from Chaucer or Malory, or even going back further to Old English. So just keep that in mind if you get frustrated next time you're asked to read Shakespeare. So again, theater is very prominent during the Elizabethan era. We've already talked about that. Also, lyric poetry is very popular, and epics are still being produced, and like we said, other forms of prose fiction as well. There's some unrest in the 1600s with the English crown. The crown gets sort of toppled for about a decade. But after the English monarchy is restored in the late 1600s, we have a few more developments and changes in English literature. So at this point, we enter the phase known as the Restoration. This is the restoration of the English monarchy, also called the Baroque period. Sometimes the book uses that term as well. But here we see literature continuing to become a little bit more modern, a little bit more what we would call today modern. So throughout the 18th century or the 1700s, we see the development of the novel, the English language novel. So we talked about this a little bit when we were discussing prose fiction and novels in particular. But the novel becomes popular in England over the course of the 1700s. You have authors like Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, other authors like Samuel Richardson, Lawrence Sterne. They wrote some important early novels during the 18th century. And then, of course, the novel migrated over to the U.S., and by the end of the 18th century, you have the beginning of an American novel writing tradition as well. We also see in the 1700s this sort of new historical phase in England known as the neoclassical or the Augustan period. So again, we don't need to know a lot about this, but just remember that neoclassical means that they are bringing back a lot of older classical forms of literature. So during this period, they're really sort of bringing back a lot of ancient styles, a lot of literary forms from antiquity. So they're kind of bringing back, aspects of ancient drama, ancient epics. They're writing epics, they're writing lyric poetry, there's still drama, of course. There's lots of satire being written during the neoclassical era. We're still familiar with some of these authors, Alexander Pope, Jonathan Swift. He wrote a pretty famous satire about eating children, so we know some of these texts to this day. They're still read and studied to an extent. So they're bringing back classical forms, but they're sort of doing some new things with them. And also the novel is developing during this time. So then we move ahead to a little bit later in the 18th century, and now we're in the middle of the Enlightenment. This is another historical development that you guys are probably somewhat familiar with. This is an era of scientific breakthroughs, new discoveries. Again, sort of continuing that trend from the Renaissance. So this also helps to change literature in the English-speaking world. So at the end of the 1700s and the very beginning of the 1800s, you have the period of Romanticism, particularly in England. But this literary movement also exists in the early United States, the young United States, right after our independence from England. But we mostly associate Romanticism with a bunch of English poets, many of whom are still read today: William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Percy Shelley. These were all romantic poets, and in a lot of ways their literature was kind of a response to the values of the Enlightenment. So you guys know the Enlightenment was all about rationality, scientific fact, the power of human reason. And those are all pretty good things. I mean, most of us like those things, but the Romantic poets were sort of pushing back on some of that Enlightenment thinking just a little bit. They valued other things like emotion, individual experience, and also kind of a personal connection with nature. So those were some of the things they were exploring in their poetry. And like I said, Romanticism kind of crossed the Atlantic, and in the early 1800s, we see it in some early U.S. literature as well. This interest in nature, the power of the individual, a lot of these things carry over, and they become a part of a later, very important literary movement in America. So let's turn our attention now to America, because up until now we've been almost exclusively focused on Europe. So let's move to the US and think about our own sort of national literary tradition and how it developed. So as we know, I've already mentioned, we are a younger nation. We haven't been around as long as these European countries, so we don't have as old of a literary tradition. But even back in our colonial past, literature was being produced on these shores in this country, even before it was an independent country. So if you go back to the 1600s and the 1700s, we did have poetry and some fiction, some prose fiction being written. A lot of it had a religious focus, and a lot of it was still largely influenced by older English models. Our first published poet, our first published writer of literature, period, was probably Anne Bradstreet, who was a Puritan woman living in Massachusetts in the 1600s, and around 1650, she had a volume of poetry published in London. Not here in the U.S., but she lived here. And even though we were still just a colony, I mean, she was living in an English colony. We were just a collection of colonies at that point. She is often thought of as kind of the first American literary writer. She was our first poet, really. But she would not have identified as an American, right? She would have thought of herself as English. She was born in England, but she spent most of her adult life living in Massachusetts. But one thing you'll notice if you study early American literature, and if you take some future classes with me, you might have an opportunity to do that. A lot of early American literature was produced by women. So not just Bradstreet, we can also look at some other noteworthy figures from our colonial days and our early independence days, and a lot of the important writers were women. So at the end of the colonial period in the 1770s, we have Phyllis Wheatley writing poetry in Boston. She's important because she was an African-American enslaved woman who was brought to Boston as a young girl. She was, obviously a slave, but she was taught to read and write by her slave masters, and she was kind of a prodigy. She wrote really sophisticated poetry as a teenager, and then she had to prove that she really was capable of writing that because of the racism of the time. But she was writing right before the War for Independence, and then right after we won our independence, another female author, Susanna Rowson, wrote our first best-selling novel, a book from the 1790s called Charlotte Temple. Now, Rowson, like Bradstreet, was actually born in England, but she spent much of her life living in the U.S., and Charlotte Temple was a very popular book. It remained the most popular work of literature in the U.S. until around the 1850s, when it was finally surpassed by Uncle Tom's Cabin right before the Civil War. So there were some important texts being produced in our colonial days and in the early days of independence, but it's really not until the 19th century, the 1800s, that we start to come into our own as producers of literature. So let's move ahead a little bit to that major literary movement that I referenced a little while ago, and that is transcendentalism. So we see that mentioned in the book, and transcendentalism owes a lot to the earlier romanticism that we were talking about with those poets and their interest in nature. So transcendentalism is similar, but it's a little bit more of a homegrown American movement. I mean, they were influenced by some European thinkers, but guys like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, these are names that we still know, and they wrote some important works of fiction and nonfiction. Emerson in particular was more of an essay writer. He did write some poetry, but he was more of a nonfiction guy. But they sort of had this larger worldview, this larger philosophy that would influence a lot of later writers. So they were interested in nature, like the Romantic poets, but they were also again, sort of centered on the individual, this idea of self-reliance, this idea that the individual can accomplish a lot without, relying on larger social structures or older traditions. They also wanted to encounter the natural world, and they wanted to arrive at sort of a larger philosophical understanding of the world around them. So a lot of those ideas, a lot of those sort of worldviews would help to contribute to a larger literary movement that was kind of happening at around the same time, around the middle of the 19th century, the middle of the 1800s. We have what's often called the American Renaissance. They don't mention that in here. They act like all of this was just transcendentalism. But really, the American Renaissance is more of a literary development. This is the beginning of a lot of really important American literary production. So a lot of big names, a lot of important texts are being written in the middle of the 19th century. So we see Nathaniel Hawthorne, we see Edgar Allan Poe producing a lot of important short stories and poems. We see Herman Melville writing novels. We see Walt Whitman writing really important poetry. We see some other writers like Emily Dickinson. These are heavy hitters that we still study today. And they're all writing between the 1830s and like the 1860s, 1870s. So this is a really important era, that sort of middle section of the 19th century. We're starting to produce some really important texts, and we still study a lot of those authors. But yeah, they're influenced by transcendentalism. A lot of them are influenced by the earlier Romantic period. And they're really kind of the first generation of famous American literary writers, the first famous generation of literature producers in this country. So that takes us up to around the Civil War. And the Civil War breaks out in the 1860s. After the war is over, after it ends, literature in this country changes pretty significantly. And in the later 19th century, we notice this move towards increasing levels of realism. We're starting to leave behind the sort of flowery, more old-fashioned styles that remain popular up until the war. In part because of the horrors of that war, the disillusionment that it filled a lot of people with, literature became a little bit more hard-hitting, a little bit more realistic, a little bit more true to life. So in the late 1800s, we see two really important schools of literature develop. We see realism, which is basically just an effort to sort of capture realistic images, realistic portraits of life through language. So we see the development of realism during this period, and we also see the development of naturalism, which is similar to realism, but a little bit different. Naturalism is really focused on portraying the effects of an environment, environmental factors or social factors, and how they affect characters. But in the process, naturalism is also trying to provide sort of realistic details, a realistic picture of how certain environments and certain sort of social structures can ruin people or corrupt people or sort of trap people in various ways. So these are kind of new styles. These are new techniques. So literature is changing a lot as the 1800s wind down, and we see new authors emerging, like William Dean Howells, like Mark Twain, who's a very famous American writer who really helped to pioneer realism. I mean, Twain was funny, he wrote comedies, but in terms of his style, in terms of his writing style, it was very realistic, and it was more true to the way that people really spoke. He was capturing everyday speech. He was capturing everyday situations in ways that really hadn't been done as much previously. In England, because realism was also happening over there, you have an author like Charles Dickens, somebody that we know. We might not have read him, but he wrote A Christmas Carol, Great Expectations, Oliver Twist. Maybe you've seen one of those movies. He's also a realistic writer, depicting real situations, lifelike characters, and often, what Dickens and some of the English realists were doing was sort of drawing attention to real problems in society. That's kind of what the naturalists were doing as well. American naturalists like Jack London and Frank Norris, often calling attention to problems in society, realistically showing those problems through their fiction. So we have a lot of novels really rising to the forefront. That's kind of the legacy of the 18th century. As we get into this early modern period, novels kind of raise up. They rise to the top. They become, by the 1800s, probably the most popular genre of literature, surpassing lyric poetry and epics, which had long been above them. Because again, novels were new. Novels had not been around as long, but by the 1800s, they are sort of dominant in the literary marketplace. Okay, so take a deep breath. That brings us up to the 20th century, the beginning of the 1900s. So we're getting close to present day now. And as we enter the 20th century, we're entering the period of modernism. So modernism, and the word might clue you in, we're getting more modern, we're getting more recognizable, more familiar. This movement really kicks off after World War I ends. So we're talking about the 1920s, really, roughly 100 years ago. And a lot of the books written during this time, a lot of the authors active during this time are still studied and are still widely admired, as are some of those figures from the 19th century that I just mentioned. But we still read a lot of the modernists. We might not read a ton of the 19th century people anymore, but we still read a lot of the modernists. A lot of this stuff, even though it is 100 years old, it holds up pretty well even today. So like I said, this style comes in after the First World War. And again, there's more disillusionment. We've just been through a very bloody conflict, a worldwide conflict that kind of shook people's confidence in certain ways. We had a lot of uncertainty. A lot of people weren't really sure. This was a time of more rapid change, more sort of rapid modernization in the early 20th century. It's easy for us to forget because it feels so long ago, but the world really was shrinking during this time. A lot of new technology had recently debuted. So by this point, 100 years ago, we had telegraphs, we had telephones, we had photography, we had movies, we had a lot of new technology, and it made the world seem like a smaller place. Air travel had recently become popular. I mean, not popular, but possible. It wouldn't really become popular for a few more decades, but you could get on a plane conceivably. So things were changing very, very quickly, and this kind of brought about a certain level of instability in the minds of many. So the modernist writers were kind of picking up on that. They were also very interested in psychology. They were interested in psychoanalysis, a particular kind of psychology that was pioneered largely by Freud during this time. So modernist writers were very interested in capturing the psychological states of their characters. So they're very much influenced by the earlier realistic writers, the practitioners of realism, like Mark Twain, who had been writing several decades earlier. They're influenced by that realistic style. They're especially interested in psychological realism. But at the same time, the modernists are kind of experimental. They're innovative. in certain ways. And they're doing certain kinds of technical innovations with their writing style. So they're kind of pioneering new techniques like the stream of consciousness narration, where we might get inside the mind of a character and we might just hear those characters' thoughts as they kind of spill out in a very unorganized, informal way. Modernist writers also like to play around with their time sequence, their plot sequence. They would fracture time. They would move us around in time and space quite a bit. So they were somewhat experimental, but they were also indebted to some of those earlier realistic traditions. So American writers were really at the forefront of the modernist movement in art. It did not just pertain to literature. There was also visual art, this kind of entered into the movie industry a little bit and other areas of artistic production. But in terms of literature, we had a lot of the prominent modernists, coming out of the States. Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. I mean, some of these names are still pretty well known today. Fitzgerald, of course, wrote The Great Gatsby. Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, he wrote The Wasteland, a pretty famous poet, a famous poem from the 1920s. And then leaving America, we could look back over at Great Britain, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf. These are all famous writers of the modernist period, and they're all doing some of the same kinds of experimentation, but they're also striving for psychological realism, and they're capturing this disillusionment, this uncertainty of the 1920s and the 1930s. So moving on, after World War II, now moving into the middle of the 20th century, around the 1950s, the 1960s, we move into the postmodernist phase, the postmodern period. Now, postmodernism is notoriously difficult to define, so I'll do my best. I don't think the book does a stellar job, but it is a hard thing to really wrap our minds around. In some ways, we're still living in the postmodern period, but we really point to the middle of the 1900s, like I said, after World War II, as the beginning of this period. And in many ways, postmodernism is just a continuation of modernism. They're continuing a lot of those same technical innovations, a lot of those same experiments with time, with narrative structure. They're doing a lot of that same kind of stuff. A lot of postmodern writers have really complex, interwoven plots, multiple perspectives, multiple, narrative points of view. They're doing a lot of the same kind of experimentation that the modernists did, but they're sort of taking it to the next level. They're pushing it a little bit further. But the important thing to remember about postmodernists is in a lot of ways their writing is very much indebted to earlier eras, earlier forms and traditions. So they're very much influenced by the modernists, but also by the writers of the realism period. But what the postmodernists often do is they're using certain conventions. They're following certain sort of rules, certain standards, but they're doing it in a very self-conscious, oftentimes ironic, or maybe comedic way. So let me explain what I mean. So a lot of postmodern works will be very much steeped in earlier traditions. They'll be, very much influenced by earlier text. And they'll be, a detective story or a thriller or a romance on the surface. There'll be these sort of traditional types of literature on the surface. And they're very aware of all of the rules that they're following, all of the conventions that they're following, but they draw attention to those conventions. They're following them, they know them, but they're also kind of pointing at them almost to reveal the artificiality of the entire text. So we often call postmodern literature, we call it meta or metafiction. Metafiction is simply fiction about fiction, or fiction that's aware that it is fiction. And it draws attention to the fact that it is fiction and not real. So if you remember when we were talking about drama, I mentioned the fourth wall and the concept of breaking the fourth wall. What does that mean? Well, the actor on stage turns and directly addresses the audience. We can see this even in movies, where we break that fourth wall. We sort of break that mutual understanding, that suspension of disbelief that the audience always undergoes when they're watching a movie or a play or reading a novel. We know what we're watching or reading isn't real, but we're pretending. But when the actor talks to us, when the actor directly acknowledges us, or when the author of a book directly acknowledges that they are using some literary tradition or convention, that's like tearing down the fourth wall and showing us or reminding us in the audience that, hey, this is all made up. This isn't real. This is a work of art. This is a work of literature. I'm using these older forms. I know I'm using them. I'm using them very self-consciously. And maybe I'm also kind of making fun of them. If I'm a postmodernist, maybe I'm kind of having fun with these structures, these older forms, and I'm kind of showing their limitations, but I'm also showing that I like them and enjoy them. So this can go in a lot of different directions. A lot of postmodern literature is thought of as being kind of playful. Some people think it's fun. It's often, like I said, kind of comedic, kind of ironic in nature, but that bothers some people, and it can be very annoying to some people as well. So some noteworthy figures of this movement include John Barth, Thomas Pynchon. They're pretty famous American examples. John Fowles is an English postmodern writer. So again, they're all doing similar things. They're kind of meta. They're very self-conscious. They're drawing attention to the artificiality of some of these fictional forms, but they're also using those forms to do some interesting things. So again, kind of playful. They can be very dense. The plots are often very complex, a lot of different threads, a lot of different sort of subplots. And again, sometimes they're almost being intentionally absurd or ridiculous by piling plot on top of plot on top of plot, making it almost impossible to follow. Again, like the book says, they're following sort of certain conventions. Like think about like the cop drama or like a crime drama. They're following those conventions, but almost in a formulaic way. Like they're following them so closely that it almost becomes kind of funny. It almost becomes kind of a silly thing that they want us to notice and maybe laugh at. So you can maybe tell why opinion is often mixed about postmodernism. Some people really like it. Some people think it's obnoxious. If any of you are movie fans, if you know Quentin Tarantino, the movies that he makes are often considered postmodern. And that's a little bit of a different use of the term, but basically what we mean is that all of Tarantino's movies are very much aware that they are movies. And Tarantino is very much influenced by older movies, older traditions, older styles. So if you watch almost any of his movies, he's always sort of, using a particular style or genre, like the Kung Fu movie or the gangster movie or the Western. He's always operating in one of these older forms. So he's using the rules, but he's kind of having fun with the rules. He's referencing other movies, so he's very aware that he exists in this movie universe. He wants his audience to get those references. He's ironic, but he also loves the stuff that he's using and sort of riffing on. So again, it kind of pulls you in different directions. There's irony. We're supposed to recognize the artificiality, but we're also still meant to enjoy the text and be entertained oftentimes. So, again, not everybody digs postmodernism, and there's a lot of confusion to this day about what constitutes postmodernism. What is postmodern? How do we define it? There's a school of thought, there's an argument that's sometimes made, you don't have to buy this, but some people will claim that all fiction, all poetry, all plays produced now, today, are almost bound to be postmodern, because everything's kind of been done, like all the genres have been created, all the different works of literature are out there, so we're always influenced by those older forms. Now, of course, we can do new things, but there's a school of thought that now we are living in the postmodern era where everything is accessible. We can become sort of, steeped in certain niches, certain, unique, very specialized genres. And a lot of art that is produced today is kind of self-conscious. It is kind of meta. It's very aware that it is art, and it might even be commenting on its own status as art. So we see that in music, we see that in literature, we see that in a lot of different art forms today. I don't think all forms of literature today are postmodern, however. So there are a few other traditions and developments that happen after postmodernism kind of reaches its peak in the 60s and 70s. And also keep in mind what's going on socially and culturally during the 60s and 70s with the civil rights movement and Vietnam and a lot of social upheaval and, again, more change, more instability, and a lot of writers are using some of these postmodern techniques to reflect on a culture that, again, is fracturing in some ways, changing, youth culture kind of at odds with older adults. So some of that kind of weirdness and instability is also a part of postmodernism, just like the earlier instability of the earlier 20th century was a part of modernism. But moving ahead to like the 1980s, as our society is changing, opening up in some ways, becoming a little bit more tolerant in some ways, we see an increased amount of women's voices in literature, and we see more and we hear more minority voices in literature. Beginning not just in the 80s, but we see it more and more in the 80s and the 90s, all the way up until the end of the 20th century. So really important women authors like Margaret Atwood, who's actually Canadian. She wrote the Handmaid's Tale, which is now a pretty popular show. She was active in the 80s. African American authors like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker were active in the 80s. Joyce Carol Oates, another important woman author from the States. They're all producing very important works during that period. And also, we see the rise of post-colonial literature in the 1980s and continuing on through the 90s. So we're seeing these types of texts coming out of the Caribbean and Africa, places like India. These are former English colonies, just like us. So as a result, they have English language literary traditions. People there speak English. English is taught in school, and English is often the language used in their literature. But the writers, increasingly at the end of the 20th century, the writers in those places, are black or Indian, and they're expressing their own experiences, their own getting their own voices heard, and kind of speaking against, pushing back against the colonial legacies of their nations, of their regions of the world. So that continues to be kind of a popular development today. Post-colonial literature, we can consider that to kind of exist here as well. We kind of have a post-colonial existence here. We have a somewhat similar history, but that's much of the Western Hemisphere, right? You can find post-colonial lit in South America, Mexico, the Caribbean, Canada, and probably here as well. So today, just to kind of wrap things up, today literature in the U.S. is pretty much a mixed bag. We see a lot of different things coexisting. We still see A lot of postmodernism. A lot of postmodern texts are still around. Like I said, some people would argue that all literature produced today is at least a little bit postmodern because of our influences, because how self-conscious we are nowadays. But even if you don't buy that, obviously some authors are still working within that sort of postmodern style and tradition. But remember that other writers, other popular writers today are working in more sort of traditional modes. They're using more traditional kind of older styles. So one example is Jonathan Franzen. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him. He's a pretty popular novelist today. He just, like modern day, contemporary times. He just came out with a novel called Crossroads. It was actually published earlier this month. One of his famous ones is called The Corrections, that came out about 20 years ago. But Franzen is a little bit of a throwback. I don't really think of him as a postmodernist. He's going for more of a modernist style, or more of a sort of realism style. He's kind of hearkening back to some of these older eras, some of these older traditions. But he's obviously still a modern writer. So, like the modernists, he's very interested in psychological realism. He wants to sort of plumb the depths of his characters' minds, their psyches. And again, we understand more about how the human mind works. You know, over the last 100 years, we've discovered more about that than we probably knew, and for all of time up until then. So he's very much influenced by the modernist interest in psychological realism, but he's also well schooled in the traditions of realism. He's trying to capture life as it is. He's often writing about families, family life, capturing everyday routines, everyday speech, everyday situations. But, he still experiments a little bit. He has some innovations. He's still obviously influenced by some of what's happened with postmodernism. But again, he's kind of using a more traditional, realistic style. And he's not constantly doing meta stuff and tearing down the fourth wall. So he's a little bit more traditional. And we see novelists like him continue to have success. But then we also have a lot of postmodern writers continuing to have success as well. And we've seen a little bit of the changes that, have occurred with more modern literature. So with poetry, when we read, Blackberrying by Sylvia Plath, that was a poem written in the 1960s. A lot of you noticed that it was written in free verse. We did not have a regular meter. We did not have a regular rhyme scheme. There were patterns. We did find some internal rhyme. But Plath is just kind of doing her own thing. She's not writing a sonnet like Shakespeare. She's not writing an ode like Keats. She's not really bound by all of those traditional conventions and rules of lyric poetry. And if that was true in the 1960s, you can imagine that it's very much still true today. 60 years later, a lot of poets continue to write in free verse. But some poets like to still use those traditional forms from yesteryear, like sonnets, like elegies, like odes. So again, we have a mixed bag, and that's true with short stories, that's true with novels. Some are traditional, some are new, and a lot of newer literature is not going to follow all of those same structures, all of those same rules. So again, sometimes we think of that as postmodern, sometimes we think of it as just more free and open, experimental. I mean, look at The Wolves, that example of a contemporary play. It doesn't follow all those old rules. It doesn't follow the old Greek unities. It doesn't have 5 acts. It doesn't even really have 3 acts. It's just a collection of scenes. But we see how it is kind of influenced by some of those unities, at least when it comes to action and place. So there's always this kind of balancing act when you look at literary history. There's always new innovation alongside influence from older stuff. So there's always carryover from era to era. There's always a lot of borrowing, a lot of bringing back older styles like they did back in the Elizabethan era or the neoclassical era. But we also push things forward and we do things differently. We do things in new, sort of experimental or novel ways. Novel meaning new in this case. So that continues today, and another development that we've seen is that the definition of literature has been opened up. More things can be considered literature now, so not just epics, lyric poetry, and fiction, traditional prose fiction, but also graphic novels, movies, and other art forms that would not have been considered literature in previous historical periods. Okay, so that's enough for now. We will end our history lesson there, and then we'll come back next week and start Unit 2, which is all about literary criticism and theory. So I'll see you then.